And so after years of covering this issue, I'm just soaking up all this negative energy and this hate, and it's just too much. And I need to take a break. I just need a safe space. And so I decide to move out of the population centers in Jerusalem here, in Tel Aviv here, this graffiti, kick out the N-word. So I move away from Tel Aviv, and I moved down to Dimona. And the reason why I moved there, in a small town in the desert, is because that I'd heard that there's actually a population of Africans that had been living there for decades. And surely, if they had been there for all this time, Israelis must have gotten used to their presence and gotten over this racist hatred. So I moved down to Dimona. It's actually a group of African Americans who, from Detroit and DC and Chicago, moved out to Israel in the late 60s and 70s. And their story is kind of interesting. They, at the same time as the civil rights era, and you have black people turning to the Black Panthers and some joining the Nation of Islam. And so there were African Americans who also embraced Judaism or the Torah and the Old Testament, and forged a Afrocentric form of Hebraic practice and felt affinity for the land of the Bible, felt that their communal story lines up with the mythology of the Israelites of the Bible, and so saw themselves in that story and wanted to reinvent themselves and move. They were kind of like African Zionists in a way, and they got up and they moved to Israel. And so they'd been living in Dimona for decades, and that's why I moved there in January 2013. And I'm very happy I made that transition, and I've really enjoyed this last year that I've spent in Dimona. It's awesome walking around, and everyone's wearing dashikis, and it's pretty trippy. It's a great place. I really enjoy walking around, seeing black people actually with their head. You probably will think this is so strange, but just to see African men and women walking around with their heads up and not casting their eyes down every time they pass by a light-skinned person is a relief. And so I've really enjoyed this time, but I was dead wrong about thinking that Israelis had gotten over their racism because they were living in proximity to Africans for decades. So here, again, I can't walk 2 minutes from my apartment in Dimona without being confronted with this graffiti, "We hate the N-word." And so I realized, that actually many people in the community were just as stateless as these African refugees who had arrived. So here's my friend Dalia, okay? Born in Israel, speaks fluent Hebrew, her partner is Israeli, they have a child together, yet she is just as stateless. She has no papers, she has no documents, she's not allowed to work, okay, legally. She has no access to health care. Or what if her baby gets sick? She can't go to a doctor, she can't go to a hospital, she's got nothing, all right? And she's lived there her whole life, and the only reason she has no rights is because she's not a blood Jew. And there's hundreds of people just like her who've born in Israel, lived in Israel their whole lives, and are in the same status. And so I went into the government archives and I started researching. And going back decades, I realized that this war on Africans was not new in any sense. It's only now that there's 55,000 Africans in the country, but even when there was only 1,500 Africans in the country, the government was determined as ever to drive them all out. So in 2012, you have Miri Regev, as I said, declaring that Africans are cancer, slagging them. But even as far back as 1980, you have member of Knesset Dov Shilansky, later on the Speaker of the Knesset, saying that all the Africans should be put on a boat out at sea, and people calling to drown the boat, drown them all at sea. And in 2012, you have Knesset researcher preparing an official Knesset report, which went to official police statistics, found that Africans consistently have lower crime rates than native Israelis. And because his report exonerated them, the Israeli government tanked the report, pulled it offline, and demoted him from his position. The same thing happened in the late 70s with David Glass, member of Knesset, preparing this report on the African Hebrews and noting that police statistics showed they had lower crime rates than Israelis. Yet he was dismissed from the party and his report was never followed up on and shelved. And just as today you have the vast majority of Israelis calling for all Africans to be kicked out. Okay, 61% want them all deported from the country, 18+% wanting them all jailed. So that's 80% of the Israeli Jewish population demanding that all African asylum seekers are rounded up out of Israeli cities. And back in the day, early 70s, same thing. A poll showed that most Israelis wanted the government to kick all the Africans out. Now you have the mayor of the city with the largest concentration of Africans, mayor of Tel Aviv, demanding that the government kick them all out of the country. Back in the day, same thing. Mayor of the city with the largest concentration of Africans, then it was Dimona, demanding the government kick them all out. But nowadays, the mayor doesn't only talk about it, isn't only demanding it, he's doing it too. He's sending his municipal inspectors to do their part, sending them into African restaurants to pour bleach into the cooking pots of the African restaurants so that there's no possible way that they could make a living. Last year, even the US State Department issued a report calling Israel's treatment of African asylum seekers a most significant human rights problem. But once again, the government completely ignores the report. And with Netanyahu re-elected to power, in the new government, he appoints that very same woman who called Africans cancer, who incited the race riot. He appoints her to head the Interior Committee, the very committee that determines the fate of African asylum seekers. Now, I should be fair to Miri Regev. She did apologize for calling Africans cancer. But she didn't apologize to the Africans. She apologized to Israeli cancer victims for comparing them to Africans. And the government, in March 2013, issues a report, the Sofer report, which puts together a policy for the government how to treat asylum seekers. And among the findings of this report is that those Israelis who advocate for Africans are labeled anti-Semites and potential terrorists. Premier terrorist, I guess, this Jewish booby here in the bottom right-hand corner, clearly a grave threat that you wouldn't want to encounter in a dark alley somewhere. Now, because no one's doing anything, and the Israeli government is passing measure after measure, and there's no objections, seemingly, from the world, from the international community. So it realizes it can do whatever it wants to, and it begins to outright deport African asylum seekers back to the countries they fled from. Now, I don't know if it was fate or coincidence or whether it was intentional, but the day that they began the deportations, July 15th, was exactly 75 years to the day after the Evian Conference. If you haven't heard of the Evian Conference, on the very eve of World War II, when it was already quite clear what the Nazis intended to do to the Jews, here the United States and the UK and other countries all met in Evian in France, and they convened to decide, well, maybe if you take in some Jewish refugees, and maybe if we take in, and maybe if they take in, then maybe we can save these people from being butchered. And in the end, none of these countries wanted to take in any Jews because they were Jews. And in the end, on the same day, 75 years later, Israel begins deporting these Africans because they're not Jews. Once Israel does this, then according to the UN representative to Israel, Mickey Bavli, he calls that the gravest violation possible of the Refugee Convention that Israel has signed, a crime never before committed. Now, September 2013, a year and 8 months after the government passes the anti-infiltration law, the Supreme Court says, this is an egregious violation of human rights. Unanimously, by decision of 9-0, all Supreme Court justices overrule the law, call it unconstitutional, and demand that the government release all African asylum seekers from Israeli jails within 3 months. Right after that, the Attorney General announces to the police officers, continue arresting Africans, ignore the Supreme Court decision. The government simply initiates a new law, identical to the old law in every way, but even worse than the first. So now, instead of arresting Africans and jailing them for 3 years in order to make their lives miserable, under the new provision, they can be held indefinitely, infinite amount of time, for life, potentially, until they choose to self-deport. And so at this point, African people realize there's nowhere to go. Their backs are up against the wall, and they have only themselves to count on. They can't wait for some Supreme Court to rule in their favor. The government will ignore it in any case. And so people come together, and this is no easy feat, because these Africans are from different countries and they speak different languages and they're from different ethnic groups. But amazingly they did. Here, Tel Aviv City Hall, 25,000, 30,000 people protesting, demanding their refugee rights, trying to appeal to the government and to the Israeli population, saying, we're not asking for much. We're just asking that you follow the letter of the law. You signed on to these international agreements. You co-authored this refugee convention. Abide by it. Just examine our applications openly and transparently, as you were required to, or else extract yourself from these conventions if you don't mean to abide by them. But if you do want to remain a member in good standing of the international community, then examine our refugee requests. For those who aren't, they'll have to go. But for those who are refugees, we deserve our rights. And so you have people protesting in front of the American embassy and in front of the Canadian embassy, in front of the UN, in front of the AU, really teaching Israelis a lesson in democracy, whether it's in front of the Knesset here or the Prime Minister's office, and really trying every non-violent tactic that they can think of, if it's a sit-in or a sleep-in or a teach-in or a... It's really inspiring on one hand to hear, like you heard when you were first filing in, and I played that video and you could hear people chanting, "We want freedom, no more prisons," and to be surrounded by throngs of thousands of people just demanding their human rights. It's incredibly inspiring, and at the same time it's incredibly depressing, because no matter how much they protest, the government just outright rejects their demands and says, we don't care. You can protest as much as you want. You can strike as much as you want. We're going to continue rounding you into these camps and until you agree to self-deport. And the population, as you saw, firmly backs the government's position. So it seems like there's no hope of any internal force breaking this vice grip on the African asylum seekers. And